The JFK 35 podcast is made possible through generous support from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
JFK 35 is a production of the JFK Library Foundation. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed are the guest's own and do not represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of the JFK Library Foundation staff, board, or donors, or the JFK Library. The material and information presented here is for general historical and educational informational purposes only. The views expressed in the podcast are not meant to imply any endorsement of or opposition to any organization or political party.
In this episode, we refer to legislation signed by President Kennedy that uses now outdated language to describe persons with intellectual disabilities.
The Constitution of the United States did not make the President or the Congress powerless. It gave them definite responsibilities to advance the general welfare, and that is what we're attempting to do.
President John F. Kennedy said these words at a rally supporting his bill for health care for the elderly. While his legislation didn't make it into law, it showed his view on how, as president, he had an obligation to, quote, promote the general welfare, end quote, of his constituents. In this episode of Lessons on Democracy, we explore the other ways JFK demonstrated this interpretation of his constitutional duties and how the federal government and the people could work together for a more perfect union. Coming up next on JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Jamie Richardson. Welcome to this special season of JFK 35, where we discuss lessons on democracy by looking back at President Kennedy's time in office. In this, the last episode of this season, we take a closer look at how JFK viewed the social contract between the president and the people. In particular, we'll look at how that played out for four segments of the population who had been historically marginalized in varying ways: African Americans, women, people with intellectual disabilities, and immigrants. In a letter to an organization dedicated to working for the rights of Black women, JFK called democracy, quote, a social system and a moral system as well, and we realize the full promise of American life only as we realize democracy in all these dimensions for all our citizens. Joining me to discuss JFK's work to extend this full promise of American life is presidential historian and Kennedy biographer Fredrik Logevall. Fred is currently in the middle of writing a 3-volume biography on John F. Kennedy's life. He's also advising a new Netflix series based off of his research. Fred, thanks for joining me.
It's always good to be with you.
So going back to the campaign trail, JFK developed a relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt. Early in his term, he established the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, which Roosevelt had led until her death. How do you think Eleanor Roosevelt played a role in influencing this policy on what the government should be doing towards women and women's rights?
Oh, there's no question that the former First Lady played a role, and they have a very interesting, I think, relationship, the two of them. She was reluctant, to say the least, to back him for the presidency. Eventually, she came around and strongly endorsed him. And then she was, of course, helpful to him in that close victory against Nixon. So there's an interesting relationship between the two of them. But she mattered here and was a voice that encouraged him, that pushed him to pursue these efforts. But there's another person, Esther Peterson, who we should not neglect. In fact, I think maybe is ultimately more important than even Eleanor Roosevelt in terms of giving direction to this. Peterson became Assistant Secretary of Labor and the director of the department's, that is to say, the Labor Department's Women's Bureau. And I think she was very important in persuading Kennedy to establish this commission. And this, by the way, we should note, was the first commission focused on women's issues ever appointed by a president.
And the commission would put out a final report of their findings after a few years, and it would establish many of the issues facing women in the workplace, at the home, voting. It would be a starting point for the next wave of feminism in the country. How influential do you think this report and this commission was?
Yeah, it's hard to say, and this is something that I'm still researching for my biography. So my answer is a little tentative, but I think it made a difference. No question. It spurred, I guess in particular, it spurred a needed debate in the country over women's status. It spurred, I think, movement on stalled federal measures to raise the minimum wage, to improve the labor standards of millions of not just women, but men as well. But it had obviously an effect, therefore, on the status of women.
And where would you put Kennedy in terms of presidents giving women a role and voice in the administration and in policy?
Well, I don't think anybody would claim that John F. Kennedy was a feminist, but I do think he listened to people, and I think he took important steps. He directed, for example, the Civil Service Commission to stop sex discrimination in its appointments. That's notable. And in terms of its appointment policies, in June of 1963, so about 6 months before his death, he signed the Equal Pay Act, which prohibited, at least ostensibly, wage discrimination on the basis of sex. And that's an important moment. And shortly before his death, I think this is maybe about a month before his death, 5 or 6 weeks before his death, in October of 1963, he accepted the commission's report. And in doing so, he said this: "We recognize today that a woman's proper place is not either in the home or on the job. Women should have a wide range of choices as to how they will allocate the years of their lives." And I think symbolically and more tangibly, this is a notable moment. And again, it comes not long before his own death.
And now transitioning over, we're kind of covering a bunch of important people and types of communities present in the United States, but heading over to disability rights. President Kennedy himself had experience with intellectual disabilities. His sister Rosemary, who had a devastating and controversial brain surgery that would leave her in an institution for the rest of her life. His younger sister Eunice was a tireless advocate for the disabled, eventually founding the Special Olympics with her husband, Sergeant Shriver. How did all of this influence from his siblings influence Kennedy on protecting the rights of the disabled?
I think it clearly influenced him. The family was not one to speak a lot about this issue. And so we don't find much in the written record about how these things influenced him or really anybody else in the family. But there's no doubt in my mind that given that Rosemary was just less than a year and a half younger than he was. So, I mean, he was with her really his whole life. This had an influence on him. In 1958, during the campaign, or early stages of, let's call it the pre-campaign, he paid a secret visit to Rosemary. She was a resident then at St. Coletta in Wisconsin, west of Milwaukee. She had been moved there about a decade earlier, or in the late 1940s, by their father, after the lobotomy that you mentioned. And I think Kennedy was moved. Jack Kennedy was moved by what he saw and what his sister's condition really was. How much he knew prior to that secret visit of her condition, I think, is very hard to determine. But he came away from it, I think, vowing to do something substantial in this area. And then, as you point out, Eunice, in short order, begins a sustained effort to convince their father to channel funds from his nonprofit philanthropic organization, the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation, named for Joe Jr., toward research into the causes of and treatment for mental retardation. Joe Kennedy agreed, and that brings us on our way, if I can put it that way. But I think President Kennedy, while still a candidate, influenced first his sister and then the father in this direction.
And as president in 1963, he passed, which was then, as they referred to at the time, Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centers Act, the first time the federal government took an active role in addressing the needs of people with intellectual disabilities, as well as their families. How big of a change was this for the government, and do you think it has any sort of direction to how we feel now about people with disabilities and the laws that protect them and help them?
Yeah, it's hard to say what the long-term effects of this was. My sense is, again, something I want to do more research into for my project, but my sense is that this was a very important federal law. 1963, as you say, the Mental Retardation Facilities and Community Mental Health Centers Act, as it was called, you pointed out. It sought to reduce the number of people who were institutionalized for mental illness and for intellectual disabilities, as they were called, by funding the creation of community-based mental health centers. I think that was a very progressive move in my judgment. It also provided federal funding. This funding obviously matters always in these issues. It provided federal funding for these community mental health centers and research, provided funding for research devoted to the causes and treatment of mental disabilities, of people with mental disabilities. So this is an important moment, it seems to me, with lasting effects.
Thank you. And then we are going to change courses once more and talk about kind of the most visible, I think, part of this time period is Black Americans and the fight for civil rights. And how would you describe Kennedy's evolution on civil rights from, growing up, as he was in Massachusetts and New York, then to a senator, to presidential candidate, and finally to the president who gave his civil rights address on June 11th, 1963? How would you describe kind of how he changed along the way?
Well, I think your use of the word evolution is right. And I suppose we can't say it was a particularly fast evolution. I don't think that John F. Kennedy was really prejudiced personally. He tended to treat people, he really tended to treat people the same, whatever their station in life, which I think is one of his appealing attributes. He was famous for being as respectful of the White House, gardener as he was of a visiting head of state. So I don't think he was personally prejudiced in any sort of significant way. But it should also be noted that it was not an issue. That is to say, the fight for Black equality was not an issue that really moved him. I don't think that the daily plight of Black Americans was something that he thought a lot about. And his was a white world for the most part. But, as you point out, he begins to change, and change significantly. And I think by the time we get into June of 1963, when he gives that extraordinary address from the White House on June 11th, I think he is now a true believer. And he makes in that speech civil rights and the fight for Black equality a moral issue in a way that it hasn't been before. But it's an evolution, and it takes some time for him to get to that point.
And obviously, as to go on this journey in evolution, he doesn't do it alone. Doesn't do it necessarily single-handedly. Who were some of the people that pushed him from either inside his circles or outside his circles in administration that kind of got him to where he needed to go?
It's an important question, and some of these individuals, it seems to me, have not fully gotten their due, even though we have a very important scholarship and literature on this question. And these people are recognized in these books. I think we should do more to promote their role. People like, for example, and I'll just list some of them, Roy Wilkins, Louis Martin, his own brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver, I think is important in pushing President Kennedy to shift. Harris Wofford, an important advisor, he too matters here. Martin Luther King Jr., various meetings that he had with JFK, with President Kennedy during the campaign and then after Kennedy enters the White House, he clearly has an influence. Marjorie Lawson, who was a campaign aide and was there from an early point in 57 and 58, advising him as he begins to prepare for his run for the presidency. She matters. And then finally, maybe I would point to his brother, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, who undergoes his own evolution. But I think by the end, by the time we get into late 62 and into the spring of 63, I do think Bobby's advocacy also matters.
And then what were some of the key events that, especially in the administration, 63 is a big year, but 62 we have some things happening. What were some of the key events in the country and world that influenced his decision making and evolution?
Well, an important early moment is in 1957 with Little Rock and the controversy surrounding desegregation there. The sit-ins that occur in the first part of 1960 by African Americans clearly have an influence on Kennedy's thinking. And maybe one could say that the real evolution, in a sense, begins here, because I think he's impressed by the courage, by the dedication, by the sort of stick-to-itiveness that you see by these demonstrators conducting these sit-ins over a period of months in 1960. I think that matters. As you point out, then we get into the administration, the integration of the University of Mississippi in 1962 is, I think, an important kind of transition point in Kennedy's thinking. And then finally, perhaps the University of Alabama. Now we're right up on his speech that I mentioned in the White House on June 11th. The crisis at the University of Alabama also is important here for him leading to that moment. But that's televised address. I just want to underscore again that televised address from the White House, much of it, I think, extemporaneous. I mean, he had a written text, but he also departed from that text. Is a great moment, it seems to me, in presidential history. Certainly a great moment in his abbreviated presidency. Again, 5 or 6 months before his death. It's an amazing speech.
It's something that I think it's easy to go kind of have the greatest hits of JFK, but that definitely reading it again and listening to it it's like, oh no, this is quite something.
Yeah, and I don't know if you felt this, but the kind of moral urgency that is there in every second of that speech. And when you think about the context, it's a day after his justly celebrated American University speech, which is focused on the Cold War and is conciliatory in terms of having to live with the Soviet Union and the Soviet Union having to live with the United States. When you think about the fact that these two speeches are back to back, one following a day after the other, it's a stunning example of presidential speech making, and I would argue presidential leadership.
And on the 10th, he also signed the Equal Pay Act that, I don't know if it was before or after the American. And he's just come back from his Western trip from Hawaii, so it's like this guy.
Yeah, it's quite remarkable.
And then, so our final topic, people we want to talk about for the social contract, is talking about immigration. Immigration is important, it's complex. Where was Kennedy kind of coming into the administration or to his presidency and thinking about what should be happening with immigration?
Well, I think when he was a lawmaker, so let's step back just a little bit in the House, but maybe particularly when he became a senator, this was something that was very much on his mind. In fact, he published we could think of it as a short book, but it's almost more an extended essay called The Nation of Immigrants, which speaks to the fact that John F. Kennedy didn't like then the national origins quota system, which had been in place since 1924, which Kennedy considered arbitrary, and so did others, by the way. Kennedy and others thought of this as arbitrary, discriminatory. It favored Western and Northern Europeans over all other groups, and it had low quotas overall. Kennedy believed that we have to change this. And what's notable about this is that this required some political courage to argue for this. In other words, the safe political course for Jack Kennedy in the mid-1950s, late 50s, would have been to say nothing, because in fact, the existing system was quite popular with a lot of voters. But he insisted that the process be made more transparent, that it be made more generous, and that admission be based not on place of birth, but on skills the nation needed, on humanitarian grounds of reuniting families, and on the principle of first come, first served. The other point to be made here, of course, is that Kennedy understood from his own experience, from his own upbringing, how important immigration was.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because his great-grandparents came to the United States from Ireland during the potato famine. By the time he is born, his father is incredibly successful, but obviously his parents or great-grandparents leaving Ireland was a different story. Can you talk about how that story and how that might have influenced him in his thinking?
Yeah, I mean, this is a kind of sub theme in the early part of my biography of him. I think you're absolutely right. It had a special interest for him. As you note, a century before, all 8 of his grandparents, or great-grandparents, sorry, had come from Ireland, Irish Catholics, had arrived in Boston, often under very difficult conditions. And I think their story and the story of those who arrived alongside his great-grandparents fascinated young Jack Kennedy. I think it fascinated him since boyhood. And I think he found power, or so I argue, in the broader immigration story and how much it mattered to the nation's development. He, I think, believed in this notion of a nation of immigrants, that Americans all came from somewhere, and what made the country the great country that it was, and he was an unshakable patriot, Jack Kennedy, was in part this immigrant story, and stood the degree to which these immigrant groups, not just the Irish, but others, had experienced discrimination, but also how over time, in his view, a rather rosy view, but how they had flourished. Finally, I think we should note that he saw the electoral implications of this. In other words, it helped him politically in his run for the presidency if he could speak to immigrant groups and their descendants. That's part of the motivation here, even as he sees that it could cut both ways. That if he's too outspoken in his embrace of the immigration story, that it could turn off other voters. So it's a tricky one for him in political terms.
And why did he think that new immigrants or established immigrant populations were important for democracy and for a country to work, like the United States in particular?
I think he thought that immigrants had done a great deal to make the country what it was, that they had played an essential role in the successive waves of newcomers had played a very important role in America's development, and that this continued to be true. He wrote at one point, I think this is in the book that I mentioned, A Nation of Immigrants, there's no part of our nation that has not been touched by our immigrant background. That's a quote. And then he said, everywhere immigrants have enriched and strengthened the American life. He was influenced here, we should note, by a Harvard historian, Oscar Handlin. This notion of a nation of immigrants really owes a lot to Handlin's work. Kennedy, who read a lot of history, had read that work. Handlin, I think, arrived at Harvard after Jack Kennedy finished his education, so he wasn't taught by Handlin in the formal sense, but he was taught by him in terms of his work, and I think he embraced this notion. Handlin won a Pulitzer Prize in the early 50s for his book, The Uprooted, and I think you can see a strong similarity between the picture he gave of immigrants and their importance and the one that Senator and then President John F. Kennedy articulated.
Fred, that was my final question. So thank you so much for spending all this time with us over these 4 episodes. We always enjoy our conversations with you. So thank you again.
Well, and I enjoy being with you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our 4th and final episode of Lessons on Democracy by JFK 35. If you're interested in learning more about some of the material we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page for this episode. If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or find us on social at jfklibraryfdn using the hashtag JFK35. If you like what you heard today, please consider subscribing to our podcast or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening and have a great week.